In this lesson, I'm going to teach you all about how to replace eggs in dishes. Now, one of the most common things that people ask me is, how do I bind things if I'm not going to use eggs? Well, there are many products out on the market today that actually will perform this function for you. Now, the first thing to talk about when we're talking about replacing eggs is, what exactly are you replacing? Are you replacing eggs in cooking, in baking, in cookies, muffins? What is the purpose of the egg? And that will determine what you're going to use to replace the egg. Now, I love to bake. So one of the biggest challenges I faced when I started veganizing all my baked goods was how to replace the eggs. Now, over the years, through a lot of trial and error, I've figured out what the best ways to replace eggs are in different situations. So when I'm baking, what I use as my egg replacer is determined on what I'm actually making. For example, when I'm making cookies, because cookies usually only require about 1 or 2 eggs, I like to use a commercial egg replacer product. It's usually a powder that comes in a box, and then you mix it with water, and then you just add that mixture to your recipe as you would the egg. Now, when I'm making cakes or cupcakes or even muffins, my favorite thing to use is unsweetened applesauce. I find that the applesauce keeps things really nice and moist, and it doesn't add any extra flavor that you wouldn't want in there. Whenever you're using applesauce to replace eggs, you'll use a 1/4 cup of applesauce to replace each egg. Now, I've also heard that using mashed banana works the same as applesauce. However, I've opted not to use mashed banana in my things because I'm afraid that it's actually going to give that banana flavor. Now, the last method that I use to replace eggs in baking is tofu. Now, the only time that I'll really actually use tofu to replace eggs in baking is when I'm using it to replace eggs that are a filling in something. So for example, in a pecan pie, when eggs are used in the filling, I'll use silken tofu pureed in a blender, and again, I use about a 1/4 cup for every egg that needs to be replaced. As a general rule of thumb, when I'm baking, I usually don't try and replace more than about 4 eggs. If a recipe calls for more than 4 eggs, I usually skip it. Now, not only can eggs be replaced in baking, but eggs can be replaced in general cooking too. The go-to ingredient that I use to replace eggs in general cooking is tofu. Tofu is so versatile, you can use it in practically anything that requires eggs. I've used medium firm tofu to replace eggs in scrambled eggs. I've used extra firm tofu to replace eggs in egg salad. I've even used extra firm silken tofu to replace the eggs in butter tarts. And a lot of these recipes I'm going to actually show you throughout these lessons. One of the things that I've recently discovered that makes tofu an even better egg replacer is something called black salt. It's actually pink in color, but what it does is it gives things an eggy-like taste because it comes from volcanic rock, which is infused with sulfur and therefore has that rotten egg kind of smell to it. You don't need a lot of it, but it really does help add that eggy taste that's missing from regular tofu. I find it works best in things like scrambled tofu and quiche recipes. So now I'm going to show you how to replace eggs in a baking recipe and a general cooking recipe. So now I want to show you how easy it is to replace eggs in baking. I'm going to show you a quick and easy cupcake recipe that is moist and delicious, and nobody will ever know that these cupcakes are vegan. So, as I said, it's an easy recipe. Everything goes in one bowl. So I'm adding some flour, some sugar, baking powder, salt. I've got canola oil, vanilla extract, soy milk, and then of course, to replace the eggs, I'm using applesauce. And in this case, I was replacing 2 eggs, so I'm using half a cup of applesauce. And I use unsweetened applesauce because obviously I don't want to add any more sweetness to this as there's already sugar in here. And then all we have to do is stir this up. And our batter is ready to go. So I've got a muffin tin that I've lined with some cupcake liners. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to fill these about 2/3 full. Okay, so there's all my cupcakes ready to go. I'm going to put them in a 350-degree oven for 20 to 25 minutes or until a toothpick inserted in the center comes out clean. So as you can see, my cupcakes are ready. I took them out of the oven and then I let them sit in the muffin tins for a few minutes before I transferred them to the cooling rack. Now I'm just going to leave them on this cooling rack to cool down completely before I ice them. Once the cupcakes were completely cool, I iced them with a vegan buttercream icing. And to make the buttercream icing, all I did was I simply replaced the butter with vegan margarine and I used some soy milk instead of milk. I took these to my niece's birthday party and they were an absolute hit. So as part of my lesson on replacing eggs, I thought I'd show you how I make my version of scrambled negs, is what I call them, or scrambled tofu if you'd like to call it that. So what I've got here is I've pureed some medium firm tofu in a food processor with some turmeric, black salt, and some nutritional yeast. Going to heat my nonstick frying pan up over medium heat, and I'm just going to add a little bit of oil to my pan. Now this is something that I like to make on a weekend. I often make this scrambled tofu and then I'll make like a tomato and onion gravy to go along with it, or it could even be used in a breakfast burrito. I've done that before too. It's just a very easy recipe that kind of mimics what scrambled eggs would be. So anytime you would have used scrambled eggs, this is the kind of recipe that I use. My oil's heated up. So I'm just going to add my tofu to the pan. And I know it doesn't look like much right now, but trust me, by the time this is done cooking, it really does look like scrambled eggs. So I've got all of that in my pan, so I'm just going to spread it around in the pan. And I'm just going to let this cook for a few minutes. And then as it starts to cook, you'll notice that the liquid starts to evaporate and it starts to become more solid. Then you start stirring it, and as you stir it, it should start to break up and resemble scrambled eggs. So my tofu is starting to bubble and the edges are starting to get a little brown, so I'm just going to scramble this up. And then flatten it out again. So it's been about 8 minutes now, and as you can see, the tofu's starting to firm up more. It's definitely looking more like scrambled eggs at this point. Looks like very wet scrambled eggs at this point. But within another few minutes, this should be ready. Okay, I think our scrambled tofu is just about done. Now, as I said, this is a very versatile dish. You could add some fresh veggies to this if you wanted. You could add some herbs, really whatever you feel like. Sometimes I add some veggie bacon to this, or I'll have this alongside some veggie sausages. But this morning, I'm just going to have it plain on some toast. So there you have it, some beautiful scrambled tofu using medium firm tofu in this case. Another easy recipe that replaces eggs. Now, I'm not going to say that it tastes exactly like eggs, but it definitely has the consistency. And when you're vegan, sometimes you have to make compromises and not everything can taste exactly like it used to. But I think this is a really, really good alternative. Plus, it's really healthy for you. It's got no cholesterol. It's full of protein. Way better for you than real eggs would be. So enjoy your scrambled tofu.